Public health emergencies like COVID-19 call for extraordinary action and difficult decisions. But the Constitution limits the range of tools available to government officials, not only what they can decide, but also who gets to decide and the process by which those decisions are made. The short presentation here can't do justice to the many interesting and complex constitutional questions that arise from health emergencies like COVID-19. My more modest goal, therefore, is to offer a general overview and a framework for thinking about some of the constitutional issues that are implicated by recent and foreseeable government responses. To begin, it might be useful to think about the Constitution along three dimensions: rights, federalism, and separation of powers. Regarding the first, the Constitution provides special protections for certain individual rights, to equal protection, due process, freedom of association, and so on. But these rights are not absolute. Sometimes they have to give way to other rights and the collective welfare. So how far do our individual rights extend? And to what extent must they give way to government policies like quarantines, forced isolation, and social distancing? When these policies are governmentally compelled, as opposed to merely suggested, the government must have a compelling need for the measures taken. That's a very demanding standard, which in ordinary times is seldom met. But as I began with, these are not ordinary times. That's not to say the government officials have a blank check. The government's burden to justify its actions increases the more that our liberties are constrained. And the availability of less restrictive measures can be a reason to strike down unnecessarily broad or unnecessarily coercive actions. For instance, take mandatory detention. It's essentially a type of civil confinement, a drastic measure, and generally can only be used for individuals who pose a significant risk of transmitting the virus. For those who are not known to be contagious, some lesser type of restriction, like quarantines or social distancing, may be as far as the government can go without infringing individual rights. Okay, turn to federalism. Questions of federalism have less to do with what the government policies are and more to do with who decides, as between federal and state officials. Public health emergencies like COVID-19 straddle federal and state authority. As a political matter, that requires a good amount of coordination between federal and state officials, but it could also be an area for constitutional turf battles. In theory, the federal government's powers encompass issues of national security, interstate travel and markets, and foreign relations. Meanwhile, states have a general police power within their jurisdictions, and public health and safety fall squarely within the state's sovereign power. So here's a question. Under what circumstances may states close its borders to interstate travel? For example, to what extent can Maine close its borders to New Hampshire and other surrounding states? That hasn't happened yet, but it foreseeably might be attempted. Worth pointing out here is that if a state were to try to shutter its borders, it would implicate questions of federalism and constitutional rights. More specifically, the federalism question is whether states can close their borders, or whether that's something that only the federal government can decide. Meanwhile, the constitutional rights question is whether such a restriction, whether it's by the federal or state government, would unduly infringe an individual's right to travel and to free association. Viewing federalism and rights together gives context to the many declarations of emergency emanating from the president on the one hand and state governors on the other. Federal and state officials each have powers that overlap in certain respects, but are also independent in other respects. Generally speaking, emergency declarations give government officials additional powers that otherwise would lay dormant unless and until an emergency is declared. Because each state is generally free to have their own standards for public health emergencies, there's a good deal of variance among the states about how emergencies are defined and the powers triggered by declarations of emergency. At the federal level, a declaration of emergency frees up the federal coffers for certain expenditures and triggers executive authority that otherwise wouldn't exist. For example, under the Stafford Act, an emergency declaration authorizes the president to direct federal agencies to help and assist state and local governments with health and safety measures. Under a different statute, the Public Health and Services Act, a declaration of emergency unlocks additional and different powers. Among those powers, agencies can waive certain federal laws that would otherwise apply. For example, the FDA might relax or suspend certain requirements for testing and approvals of drugs and devices. Now, turning to our third and last constitutional dimension, separation of powers. Like federalism, questions about separation of powers are most centrally focused on questions of who decides. But in this context, the choice is not between federal and state, but rather among the three federal branches of government. Under the Constitution, Congress has primary responsibility and authority to establish federal policies relating to health emergencies. But Congress has delegated a good amount of discretion and decision-making authority to the president, who in turn has delegated a good deal of authority to the heads of certain federal agencies. Outside of the COVID context, some conservative justices on the Supreme Court have recently expressed a desire to impose greater constitutional limits on the scope of congressional delegations to the executive branch. Those murmurs from the court make it conceivable that the breadth of the delegations in some of the emergency federal statutes at issue could violate separation of powers principles. But in my estimation, it's highly unlikely that the court would take that drastic step in the context of COVID-19. In fact, were the court to strike down the emergency statutes or parts of them on non-delegation grounds, it could give rise to a different separation of powers issue, that of judicial overreaching on matters that are arguably left to the political branches to decide. Another separation of powers question could arise if the president were trying to exercise authority that was not delegated to him by statute. That issue was raised, for example, when President Trump declared a national emergency to trigger powers and funding for a border wall, which arguably aggrandized Congress's power of the purse. In regards to COVID-19, however, and as matters currently stand, the policies emanating from the White House are likely within the authority delegated by Congress. Of course, that can change. And I would also note that some of the emergency statutes at issue are ambiguous, in which case questions of statutory interpretation might merge with the constitutional question of whether the president is overstepping executive bounds. For example, the Stafford Act, which I mentioned earlier, authors two types of presidential declarations, an emergency and for national disasters. Trump has already unlocked the emergency provisions of the Stafford Act. Declaring a major disaster would unlock additional powers, but it's far from clear whether the statutory definition of major disaster can include a pandemic such as COVID-19. Specifically, the statute defines a major disaster as any natural catastrophe, which the statute goes on to say includes things like hurricanes, tornadoes, tsunamis, earthquakes, and more. This list of examples that are written into the statute strongly suggests that what Congress intended at the time of enactment was to cover large-scale physical events. And if that's so, then by negative implication, biological threats like COVID-19 are arguably not covered, especially given that these threats would be covered by the national emergency provisions. I hope you found this overview helpful, and for more details and information, you might find information and sources listed on the next slide helpful. Thank you.